Is this studio build going too far? I'm going to say yes, it is. Even though I started here and so far I've gotten to this point in terms of frequency response, which I think is great. There's a bunch I've learned. I've spent the last 2 weeks putting the frame up, testing as I put insulation in, and I want to share with you where I feel is the best bang for buck when treating your room, where there was a point of diminishing return where I think I wasted money, I lost space in the room, and it was just redundant work I did. I want to discuss with you managing the time domain and the frequency domain and how it affects the sound of the room, or at least what I found in this room. And then finally, there was some advice two YouTubers gave me, Ed Thorne and Drew Vespers, which I blissful arrogantly ignored and realized I shouldn't have ignored because it's a real thing, and I'll discuss that later. So when I started filling out this room, I did progressive room tests. Here was the raw measurement of the room, and we can see a big dip here at 80 hertz. Now, this response here, all these peaks and troughs, are the modal room modes getting excited because there's nothing controlling them or nothing slowing them down or absorbing their energy, which means you get big peaks, big troughs. It's not good for listening. That's plus minus 12.5, 13.5 decibels from the highest peak to the lowest trough. So I thought, what would happen if you just treat the first reflection points? Okay, we're going to bring that up. Didn't do much on the frequency domain, but what it did was in the time domain, if we look at our RT60, we went from having over a second of reverb tail, okay, in the mid-range, and just treating the first reflection points, not the entire walls, just the first reflection points, that went down in half. And then I did the first reflection on the ceiling, not the entire ceiling like it is now, and it brought it down even further. And this taught me my first thing. In total, that amount of treatment, just for the first reflection points on the side and the ceiling, would have amounted to, if I built them out as panels, probably $300. Okay, $300 for this improvement here, from here to here, even though 500 milliseconds is still relatively long. It is a huge improvement, and that's where I think was the best bang for buck in this build. And I would advise anybody who has any studio monitors to just build out baffles for the first reflection points. I know that's common advice given, but I'm going to just go a little bit deeper here. Do not build out, like, this is my advice, I would not be building out first reflection point treatment for just the left and right walls. And this is because modes exist across all axes. So if we go over to here, the room mode calculator, okay, so these are my room modes, okay? We can see them there. Now, you've got different kinds of room modes. You've got axial mode, so modes which relate to two surfaces, okay? So that's a pressure that builds up between two surfaces. You've got tangential modes, which are not just opposing surfaces, but it's opposing axes, so the X and Y axis modes, the Y and Z axis modes, and then you've got oblique, where all three dimensions create a modal response. The reason why, if you're treating first reflection points, you should do the first reflection points on the side, ceiling, and back wall, is because you want to evenly treat the interaction between all the axes of your room. And I think even at $300, you can build, $300 will get you, I'll show you this, R5 earth wall, okay? This is R5 earth wall. This is 5.5 square meters of insulation. There's 11 bats in here for $76. This is really good stuff because it has a low gas flow resistivity. If I go over to here, where are we? Insulation. This is Australian tested stuff, and we go to thickness, we'll put that descending, 210. The 5.0 earth wall, where are we? Earth wall, not the 5.0, the 4.0 earth wall, sorry, 4.0 is 5,000 gas flow resistivity. Actually, there's the 5 one, 8,700. You want a gas flow resistivity under 10,000. Preferably 5,000 is really good. That is going to, for $70, give you enough insulation to treat your first reflection points for the side walls, the ceiling, and the back wall. Then you just need a bit of framing timber, which is $4, $5 a linear meter, some fabric. For $300, you've got your whole room treated to a point where you're bringing the reflection points of that first listening positions down at a bang of a buck. Now, something you don't want to do is get insulation that is sound bats, because they're very dense. Okay, those sound bats, okay, if I go sort that descending, those sound bats like the super high definition earth wool and the Bradford gold stuff is 22,000 pascals. And that means basically they're much denser. And the problem with something that is denser is that it's more reflective at lower frequencies, and we don't want that. So best bang for buck, first reflection points. Good learning experience. Next thing was the back wall insulation. Now this is going to surprise a few people, is that back wall is 0.5 meter deep. Okay, so that's 12 inches is 300 millimeters. And then if you add another 8 inches, that's about it's around 20 inches deep, that whole back wall, as a massive bass trap. Because I thought it was going to have a greater effect on the low end than it would if it was just 8 inches deep. The reality is I did progressive tests every time I put a layer of insulation in. Unfortunately, these tests got lost. I don't know how. But what I can say is there was a diminishing return. A 210 mil across the whole wall, so 8 inches across the entire wall, performed marginally worse than 0.5 meter. So doubling all of that did nothing. Going from 8 to 20 inches did very little in just absorption on the low end. Yeah, it brought my RT60 time down quite a lot for everything else, but it was still a diminishing return because just that first layer brought it down to an acceptable level. What would I do again? I would not build out a wall that thick. I would go maximum 8 inches and be happy. That was probably a very expensive, both real estate wise, because I've lost floor space there, and insulation wise. The third thing was managing the time domain versus managing the frequency domain. Here's the thing, I actually managed the frequency domain before I did the time domain, and I'll explain why. In this video here, I go through testing this room and exciting the room modes with a speaker in that corner and a microphone in that corner. And this was on Yesko's advice. It was also on Yesko's advice, while all those room modes are excited, to find the optimum listening position for the speakers and my optimum listening position in the room. And basically what that allowed me to do is to recognize the modal response of the actual room in real life. So not just in a calculator, but actually see how this room responded on a graph in real life, and that's what you have here on this plot. But then also see how speaker positioning and listening positioning interacted with the play of those room modes. I think that set me up for a great success, because what that meant was I was starting from my listening position in the most balanced of these room modes. If you see these room modes, they all tend to be plus minus 2-3 dB of one another. So if I go to my waterfall, all these peaks of the room modes are relatively equal in amplitude. Now, is that a good thing? Absolutely not. We don't want that many room modes and that much ringing out with an untreated room. But it got me in a position where I had the most even balance of the room modes. Now, how do we go from that to this here, where it goes from plus minus 13.5 to plus minus 5 dB. Well, what we do is, if we go back to our waterfall here, not for that, we're going to go back to here. If we go back to our waterfall for here, we control the time domain. So a lot of people think when you're putting broadband trapping in, you're trying to attenuate the frequencies. You know, you're trying to control these peaks or control these troughs. You're not actually doing that. You're actually controlling the reverberation time of them so they don't lap over themselves and boost themselves or null themselves due to phase. It's like proximity effect in a microphone. When you get really close, you've got low frequencies going around the diaphragm and multiplying on themselves. It's the same in a room. When you've got your speakers playing into the room, if you're not muffling that reverberation, it's just going to fold back into itself and cause phase issues that either create these peaks or these nulls. So, frequency domain is dependent on understanding the room mode. So that's one thing I'd say to do. Do a test with nothing in your room, excite the room modes, put a speaker in one corner, a microphone in the other, figure out where your room modes are, and then from that, get your speakers positioned, get your listening positioned, so you've got an optimum balance of those modes. And I've got a whole video on that here, which you can check out, which I think was a real game changer in this whole build so far. Also, on another note, you probably notice that this measurement here is post sonar work. So there is DSP happening in this room. And you're probably curious, what was the response without the DSP? So it went from plus minus 13.5 to plus minus 77 to 61. That's plus minus 7.5 dB. But the reason why I'm not stressed about this is because this managed the time domain. Okay, so if I go over to my waterfall plot here, and we'll go center, left, right, okay? In the time domain, I've done really well. I've gotten rid of all those peaks ringing out like they were before. Before, lots of peaks ringing out. Now, no peaks ringing out. And that's really important because things like SonarWorks cannot manage ringing or modal response in a room. Now, with that, once I manage this here, okay, with the insulation that's in the room, we don't have any ringing below 350 hertz or no noticeable ringing, then I could apply SonarWorks and we get to a frequency response that looks a little bit more like that, where it's nice and flat. Now, SonarWorks can't do this frequency change can't make these changes if there's ringing out at those frequencies, because those peaks and nulls will just continue to naturally occur. So that's something to note, okay? You can't treat the frequency domain without treating the time domain. So by treating the time domain, even though this frequency is plus minus 7.5, on a waterfall, if we go back to here, okay, in the time domain it's been treated. Here raw, time domain not treated. Here post, let's go over to here, time domain treated, and then with time domain treated, we can head over to actually using SonarWorks. So the final thing I wanted to bring up with you was my blissful arrogance. See, my setup is 2 speakers, a very small desk, not a lot between me and the speakers, and both Drew Vespers and Ed Thorne said you're going to deal with floor bounce at that height. There's going to be some cancellation at around the mid 100 hertz, 130, 140 hertz. I was blissfully arrogant and ignorant and thought, I don't need to treat this, until this happened. A new resonance, a new dip popped up here. After I treated the time domain of my room modes, the speaker boundary interference was much more prominent, and I got this dip here. So what did I do? I put some insulation on the floor. And then what happened to that? Where are we? Let's get rid of this. What happened? This happened. Let me change the color. That's a really bad color. Blue on blue does not work. Blue on yellow works. That's what happened, okay? It went from, I got a, let's go 69 to 61. I got an 8 decibel improvement by putting insulation on the floor, which is annoying because now I've got to build out 2 boxes, one in front of the desk and one rectangle that's going to sit on the floor in front of my desk, and 2 little squares which will sit on the floor in front of the speakers. And that's sort of what I got jigged up in front of me to deal with this floor bounce. And that's why this measurement up the top deals much better. So floor bounce is real. And Ed Thorne, Drew Vespers, you guys were right. So now what's left for the builds? I got to finish running the cables for the Atmos rig. I got to run HDMI, aux cables. Basically, I want to have all my gear, and not all my gear, all my interfaces, patch bays, and other bits and pieces in the bottom of that back wall. So that way at the front, I've only got my monitor and gear. I'll even be able to put a computer back there and then have everything on a screen at the front. I'm going to run a big HDMI cable down. You've got to run the cables. Then once the cables are done, because I don't really want to have ladders on the floor in here once I lay the floor. So once the cables are done, I'm going to lay the floor. Once the floor's laid, then I'm going to wrap the walls. Once the walls are wrapped, it's pretty much done. I've got to put in the sheer curtains and we're good to go. So that's going to be fun. Oh, also on the weekend, I don't know if you can see up there, there's a little void in the top section of that back wall. I'm going to pre-wire a projector in there. We're going to have a little cabinet in there with a door that opens and closes. And yeah, I'll put a projector up there and we'll see how that goes. But anyway, with all that, I'm going to leave you guys to it. And I'm going to get back to my morning. So take care.